Hello. So this week we begin again the Torah, and we'll start with the first chapter of Genesis, Bereshit. And you can find, if you're interested in a lot of very interesting material, in my humble opinion, about the first chapters of Bereshit, and in general the book of Genesis, you can find it in the audio archive of the blog, MyDrash, WordPress, mydrash.wordpress.com. But for now, we'll talk about the first verse of the Torah, and we will start with the interpretation that the Midrash gives the verse. That interpretation raises a lot of, it's somewhat of a strange statement by the Midrash. And then we will talk about the interpretation of that Midrash by Baruch Halevi Epstein. We'll talk a little bit about who Baruch Halevi Epstein was, what books he wrote, etc. And we'll talk about his interpretation. So, the first verse of the Torah states, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the sky and the land, the heavens and the earth. This first verse has been the subject of a lot of discussion on multiple levels of the first question is, just in terms of the structure of the first chapter of Bereshit, is how to understand what this verse is saying. Is this sort of a summary of what we're about to read? That in the beginning God created the land and the heavens and the earth, and now we're about to hear about how He did that. Okay, so this is sort of just the heading of the section. Or is that actually an action? God created the heavens and the earth, and then He did everything that's going to follow. Okay. On the one hand, the next verse talks about how v'ha'aretz hayta tohu v'vohu, that the land was something. So the land already exists in the next verse. On the other hand, the shamayim, right, the heavens don't. There is mayim, there is water, but the shamayim only appear officially in the second day of creation. So, what does that mean? So that's one question which some of the commentators have discussed. Another question is, another issue which I believe I saw somewhere, and if not, then here's another small chiddush on the way. But in and of itself, there's a big statement here that we may usually not pay attention to. The term for God that appears here is the term Elohim. Okay, we have traditionally two names that usually we hear God referred to in the Bible, and those are Elohim and Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the actual name of God. And we've talked many times, and we will talk today a little bit about the difference between these two. But what's interesting about the name Elohim is that we find it also in other contexts, where it's the plural of Eloha, the plural of false idol. Okay, but the word Eloah really means God. So in other words, the word Elohim, which we read as our God, can be interpreted as our gods, okay, in the plural. And so when the verse comes along and says Bereshit bara Elohim means that God created, not the gods created. Okay, the word bara is singular, so there's a single reference. It's already a huge statement. It's actually the statement of monotheism, right, which is that there is one God, and all these other gods that you guys talk about, those who worship false idols, all the forces that you attribute to different gods, like the sun and the moon and rain and the ocean and Mother Earth and all these different entities, they're all one. Okay, in other words, they're all one in this thing we call God, and they're not separable. They're not different forces controlled by different entities. They are all one force. Okay, and that's all encapsulated just in that little statement, bara Elohim. That God created, God and not gods. Okay, because the word bara is singular. But I want to talk about a famous midrash about this beginning. The midrash says, Bereshit bara Elohim. The midrash asks, Tanya. This is a midrash that appears in the Yerushalmi Talmud. As I'm sure many of you know, we have two sets of Talmud. The major one, which we learn most of the time, and the one which is more extensive and more clear, is the Babylonian Talmud. But we also have the Yerushalmi Talmud, which was written in Israel, unlike the Babylonian one, which was written in Babylon. And so in the Yerushalmi Talmud it says, in Masechet Chagiga, Lama nivra olam bebet v'lo be'alef? Why was the world created with the letter bet and not the letter aleph? Mipnei shehabet leshon bracha ve'alef leshon arira. Because the letter bet indicates a blessing, just like the letter B indicates the word blessing. Ve'alef leshon arira. The aleph indicates a curse, because the word arar, the curse, it starts with the letter aleph. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Eineni boreh oto be'alef, shelo yomru ech ya'amod ha'olam shenivla b'lashon arira. So God said, I will not create it with the letter aleph, so that no one says, how can the world stand that after all it was created with the language of a curse. And I will instead make it with the letter bet, which is a letter that's associated with a blessing, a bracha. And may it stand. Okay, so what the MyDrash is actually saying is that the first words Bereshit bara Elohim, Bereshit, is bet, right? That's with the letter bet. And the MyDrash was wondering, bet is the second letter in the alphabet. I mean, wouldn't it make more sense to start the Torah, the beginning of the Torah, to be with the beginning of the Hebrew language? Okay, with the letter Aleph, which is the first letter in the Hebrew language. Okay, so we hear the question. We can understand perhaps symbolically, why one might think that you would start the Torah with the letter Aleph. Okay? In a sense you could think that, God could have arranged the letters in any way that he wanted. So would it make sense that the first letter of the Torah will be, Aleph, just like it's the first letter in the alphabet? And then the answer is very strange, because it's saying that Aleph is associated with curses, the letter Bet is associated with a blessing, and so I wanted to start with a letter that is associated with blessing. This is very strange, because it's true that the word bracha starts with a bet, and the word arur, to curse or be cursed, starts with an aleph. But we could have thought of multiple words that mean good stuff in aleph, like emet, like ahava, right? Truth, love. And we can think of multiple words that mean bad things that start with bet, like bechi, to cry. Okay, so what does this mean? That there's one bad word somewhere that starts with the letter aleph. So what? Why is that a reason to change from what we had intended? So I guess you probably can search and find many explanations for this MyDrash. I want to talk today about Reb Baruch Epstein. So a quick review of his life. So Reb Baruch Epstein was born in 1860, and he died in 1942 during the Holocaust. I'm not aware of where he died in the Holocaust or what exactly he went through during the Holocaust, so I can't expand on that. But he was a very interesting person. First of all, he was the son of Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, who wrote a famous book called the Aruch HaShulchan, which was written in parallel to the Mishnah Berurah, and is a very detailed halachic book, which many people rely on today to in their psak halacha. He was also the nephew of the Netziv of Volozhin, who was one of the great luminaries of that generation, and the head of the famous Volozhin yeshiva. And he in fact wrote a book called the Makor Baruch. His name was Baruch Epstein. He wrote a book called Makor Baruch. One part of that volume, which talked a lot about his life in Volozhin, and specifically there's one volume which was published also in English called My Uncle the Netziv. Okay, talking about what it was like to live with his uncle for a while in his midst. What kind of a life his uncle the Netziv led. So very interesting. Perhaps even more interesting was that he was a supporter of portions of the Zionist movement, and specifically also the most interesting part was what he did. He was, even though he was associated with great rabbinic families. Um, Yet, even when he was offered to become a rabbi somewhere, he declined. Instead, he went to learn banking, and he was a banker. That's what he did for his for a living. He was not an official rabbi anywhere. According to the story that I heard, he came to his uncle and or to his father and told him, I'm a banker, and this is what I'm doing, and I don't want to take money for teaching or for being a rabbi, but I also don't want to stop. I find that I don't have time to learn too much. So what am I going to do? So I forget if it was the Netziv or his father that told him, what? Whenever you learn, you'll find some good idea. You write it down, and eventually you'll have enough ideas that will be able to become something you can publish. And indeed, he did. He did exactly this, and that's where we have an edition of the Bible that is known as the Torah Tamima. And if you look at the Torah Tamima, you'll see that what it is that in addition to what he basically does is he brings midrashim that he found during the time that he was learning, and any idea that he had about that midrash, and it could be a midrash like a story like we do over here most of the time, or it can be a discussion in the Gemara that refers to the verse. He wrote down his chiddush. Okay, so it's sort of a nice way to get interesting ideas on midrashim when you're learning the five the Torah. Anyway, what does he explain? He has a brilliant idea of what this midrash means. Okay, and he goes back to the original question: what does it mean? Why would the Torah start with a bet? Let it start with an aleph. He says, think about it. What does the first verse say? Bereshit bara Elohim. Why would it just say? Now the word Elohim, God's name, starts with an aleph. Yeah. The real question, he says, wasn't, oh, there's a bet and here's an aleph. That's just a way for the midrash to sort of make the question sound perhaps more like have more of a sort of what? Yeah, have more of an allure in a sense to the reader. Okay, it's sort of like a nice way to present the question. The real question, he says, is why doesn't the first verse say Elohim bara Bereshit? God created in the beginning. Why does it say in the beginning God created? That's already a much more interesting question, right? Because the word God does appear, and it would make much more sense for God's name to appear at the beginning. Not only that, some people have interpreted some other midrashim to indicate that somebody might actually understand the first verse is saying Bereshit bara Elohim, meaning some entity called Bereshit created God. Okay, Bereshit bara Elohim. So I want to make it clear. Just write Elohim bara Bereshit. And in that context, the question is much more interesting. Why is it indeed? And then the answer is even more interesting. What is the answer? We said Aleph starts with is the beginning of a of a curse. Bet is the beginning of klala. So it's saying basically, according to this interpretation, that God's name is associated with a curse. And what does that mean? Right? What exactly could that possibly mean? So here we go into the meaning of the word Elohim, that name of God, versus other names that God has, such as Yud Kei Vav Kei. Okay, which is sort of God's more personal name. So in other MyDrashes, we've talked about this also, that Elohim and Yud Kei Vav Kei reflect basically two ways that God interacts with creation. Elohim refers to Midat Hadin, to the approach of din, of judgment, okay, and Yud Kei Vav Kei refers to Rachamim, to mercy. Judgment associated with a whole set of concepts which have to do with truth, with structure. Okay, everybody is equal before the law. There's no room for changing, relating to different people differently. There's very little room for miracles of certain kind. Definitely, God is not interested in the individual as much as He's interested in creation as a whole. when you think of him in that context. Whereas mercy indicates, treating an individual as an individual, right, as something special, as, going out of your way, out of the rule of judgment, to do something special for somebody, for an individual, for something specific. And so, according to that, now we can understand what the MyDrash is trying to say about Aleph, or in other words, as we're understanding it now, Elohim being a language of a curse. Because we know about MyDrashim that say that God saw that He could not create the world in Midat Hadin. Creating the world under Midat Hadin with alone, okay, would not work, because judgment is too harsh, and from the very moment you try to create the world, it will collapse onto itself, because it won't be able to stand before God's judgment. Okay, and so that's why we need this other portion. The MyDrash says, we need to also have rachamim. We have to have mercy to somehow balance it out and allow for the world to exist. This is where tshuva comes in, and a few other, and a lot of other things. This really is sort of a very broad topic in and of itself. So now the question is, again, what does this mean? So we understand, okay, that beginning with Aleph would not have worked, right? Because if God were to try to create the world with Elohim, then we wouldn't be able to survive, right? It's this sort of stark, judgment kind of perspective would have automatically found creation guilty, and creation would disappear automatically. But what does it mean that Bet is any better? Why is the word Bereshit, Bara Elohim, any better? Okay, so you started there, but what is the significance of that word? Okay, so you didn't choose this, but what is that word? That's not God's name, Bereshit. And okay, so it's not. And in fact, we could have just started with Yud Kei Vav Kei, right? Why did you just say Yud Kei Vav Kei Bara Bereshit, right? God, started. Why use this name if it's so problematic? Why use Elohim and not use the other name? So here, I think that there's a very nice idea that's sort of hiding over here. Rabbi Chapshan says that God wanted to use the word Elohim because He wanted the world to be created by an element of truth. Okay? And so we need to understand what that means, and again, how did we get around it by having Bereshit? So I think to understand it, we have to understand what that means, Bereshit, in the beginning. What is the significance of that statement? Why does it say Bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz? Right? What does it mean, Bereshit? In fact, when we think about it, we discover that it's actually a much more interesting question. Bereshit means in the beginning. In the beginning of what? In the beginning of time, of existence. Right? Ask any physicist or philosopher, they'll tell you that without there being anything in the world, time is meaningless. Yeah, because nothing changes. Time is only meaningful when you can see change. And before there was anything, before creation existed, before there was anything, there was no time, no space, no anything. So the beginning only means something in the context of creation. It means go back to the point where creation started, that's that beginning. Before that, even saying the words before, there was a sense of time is meaningless, right? There was, and once there was, we could do stuff. So in other words, the word Bereshit is saying God, in a sense, made there to be time, right? And a sliver of a moment after there was time, He began to create. Okay, but first there was. That's the sentence, okay? There was. There was something. Okay? Something opened up. I believe that, like a physicist will be able to tell you more specifically what they call that first moment of the Big Bang, where somehow, there was space-time, which didn't exist beforehand. And so, in a sense, the word Bereshit is talking about an opportunity, right? It's not talking about Yud Kei Vav Kei, about God's other name, the God of mercy, coming and beginning to build out of mercy. But it is saying that there was a sliver of an opportunity given, as if God sort of like slipped in, just like give a little nudge to creation by letting there be unexistence. Yes, And once there was unexistence, once there was something to work with, yeah, some framework within which God gave legitimacy to, then Elohim kicked in. Then the part which deals with structure, with rules, that's when it kicked in. And we need those rules, right? Those are the laws of nature. Those are the laws that, that basically all the whole world is built upon. Look at the first chapter of Genesis. You'll see how structured it is. Every day, how things we create on that day, and and so on and so forth. So, that structure is necessary for the world to exist. And it's more than that. By putting that, by just giving a small nudge, and afterwards letting Elohim go with it, God is saying, yes, I need a bit of mercy, but only a little bit. This world also has a standing on its very own. Okay? Not all the way, not 100%, 99.9%. This world has standing on its own. So that goes to what I was reading before in the MyDrash, where God says, I don't want to use a language of cursing. Why? So people don't say, Ech ya'amod ha'olam, shenifra b'lashon ha'irah. How can the land, survive when it was created with an aleph, with Elohim? I'll give it a bracha, and I hope that it stands. Okay, listen to that word. I hope that it stands, meaning it's a bracha, right? I give it a blessing. Let it stand. It's God saying, I give you my blessing. I'm starting you off. I'm not going to be there always in that way. I will let the name Elohim take over, a lot of the time. They give structure to the world, and, that may cause trouble in the end. But it needs to stand on its own 2 feet. And so I give it a little nudge, and after that I'll start alternating between mercy and judgment. Yes, but that first nudge, that first glimmer of mercy, okay, was just a glimmer. So God says, I'm not going to start, full blown with mercy. Mercy really only has meaning when it's in the context of truth, context of judgment. Then you can say, I'm going to go out of my way every so often to do something. But the general rule has to be, judgment has to be a rule, has to be a set of rules, of consistent rules that we follow. And so, to conclude, the MyDrash here talks about Aleph and Bet is really trying to hide a more deeper discussion about the nature of our existence here. And it's saying that God couldn't start just with Aleph, just with Elohim. But He did not want either to make this whole world just be one big act of mercy. Because just after giving a little nudge, it can, grow on its own, and hopefully it will stand. Have a good Shabbat.